So, education. You are the curriculum. Did you get that? Like, you get that message? Have you ever figured that out, that all of a sudden it comes to you? I keep looking outside of myself to figure out how to do life, and all the stuff that's actually telling me how to do life is actually right in here. I think Alan spoke to that so well. The treatment speaks to that. Almost everything that we talk about speaks to that over and over again. And the reason why we have to keep reminding ourselves over and over again that this is what it is because we keep forgetting. It's just part of the human condition, that it's hard to keep our focus on that one idea that every single lesson that we need to learn is already available to us on the inside. So I just want to tell you a little bit about, I'm going to use a little bit of a story that you're probably familiar with to kind of guide us through this. I think most of you will recognize parts of the story. But I'm going to start by just giving you a little bit of a quote from a guy named Thomas Troward. He's one of our major thinkers in the teaching. He was a judge that lived in India for 20 years. He was brought up in 19th century in England, and then worked as a judge in India for 20 years, so very influenced by obviously his English upbringing, his legal upbringing, the logical mind, and then also the Hindu philosophy that he was probably surrounded by. And so he was a master of metaphysics and metaphysical logic. And so the quote here says, I just got to increase it for my bad eyes, "We have never been out of our right path, only we have been walking in it backwards instead of forwards. And now that we've begun to follow the path in the right direction, we find that it is none other than the way of peace, the path of joy, and the road to eternal life." So I know sometimes the path doesn't actually feel that way. And what I've noticed, and there's a little bit more to the quote that I'm going to come back on, is that we have a syllabus, if you think about it. For those of you who's actually been in college or university or something, and they talk about, here's your curriculum, and here's the syllabus. This is what the teacher kind of gives you as a bit of an outline. And so I was thinking about that as an analogy and wondering, okay, so what is our syllabus? What is our outline? And so here's some of the things that I kind of see as a bit of an outline. So there's my family of origin. There's my childhood. There's my education, my relationships, my career. And then there's also my desires and my passions, my weaknesses, my strengths, and my failings. All of those things are points and opportunities where we get to sort of figure out what our pathway is and what our life experience is going to be like. And we get to sort of figure out, who am I and what am I learning from each of these different points of my life. And we move around as we get older, we move around. So even if we think, oh, yeah, in my 20s I covered all those childhood issues, they're all done. And then we find out, actually, you know what, I forgot about that little one that's underneath here. And we end up going back and tripping over it. And maybe we have an experience where a career is going really well, and then all of a sudden maybe it's just gone off a little bit off course, and now we're looking at that again. And so we cycle through all of these things, continually looking back to ourselves to try and figure out, where is my path? Where is that path that makes me feel like I'm on the right path, the path that brings me the peace and the understanding that I seek, basically. So here's a little story about what happened to me, and I'm going to use, as I say, a bit of an analogy. So at some point in this teaching, when I was probably, I would say about 5 years in, I started to look at my life and realize that I had a very fragmented life. I had, the typical stuff, like my family of origin and things like that, but I had created all of these silos. So here was one group of friends, and then over here was another group of friends who didn't know these group of friends. And then over here was another group of people that I knew who didn't know either of those two. Like, they were never, ever in the same room together. And what I started to realize was that I needed these separate groups of friends because they helped me experience different aspects of myself. So interesting, which is a good thing, right? But the interesting part of it was I realized I wasn't showing up as the same Karin everywhere. People would only get this version of Karin. Oh, this is the happy version of Karin. Oh, this is the not so happy version of Karin, right? They would get these, and over here's the intellectual version, perhaps, of Karin. And so there was not this consistency and authenticity about who I was. And I was starting to get, frankly, a bit exhausted, because it was almost like there were all these different parts of me that I had to hold up all the time. And I just thought, really what I want to do is I want to be in a place where I'm just me, regardless of who I'm interacting with, which requires a certain amount of self-acceptance as I started to dig deeper. And it also required a certain amount of truth-telling to myself. How do I speak my truth? How do I show up? How do I feel comfortable being who I am in all of these circumstances? And if I don't feel comfortable being who I am, what does that look like? Where am I retreating? Where am I withholding? And how do I have that kind of experience? So how many of you have seen The Wizard of Oz? I'm really hoping everybody. For those of you who haven't seen it, I'm hoping I can kind of give you enough fill-in-the-blank kind of stuff, and you've probably heard about it culturally. But I want to use that as a little bit of an analogy. So as I was working on this, I want to be authentic experience and operating on my "you are the curriculum" concept, I actually went to a New Age store, kind of like Banyan's or something like that. It was in Kelowna. And I got myself a crystal that was supposed to help with truth-telling. And I wore it right here as a reminder, like a physical reminder that would say to me, okay, breathe and tell your truth and try and do it in a loving, honest way, whatever it was, or as much as I could be, to just sort of stay in that authentic part of who I was everywhere I went. And so with The Wizard of Oz, so if I kind of think of myself as a Dorothy, just for a moment or two, when I look at that story, you've got the relative experience. Remember how it goes from black and white, and then it switches as soon as she gets into Oz, it's all in color. So the black and white is our relative, this world kind of experience that's going on. And the color one is the absolute or the metaphysical experience of what's going on, or you could just call it the mythological experience of what's going on. You can use a lot of different analogies with this particular story. So you've got these two layers happening. So she, the big tornado comes in, and if you think about it metaphysically, the tornado would be some huge disruption in your life. So you can imagine, 16 years old, a tornado is going to be pretty disruptive to your life, right? They end up, she bangs her head, she goes into this state, and lo and behold, she ends up in this crazy land where she meets scarecrows and all kinds of people and tin men and all of that. And so as she goes through that, what's really happening is what's the through line. The through line is follow the yellow brick road. And every single chance she gets tempted, just like we're talking about Troward, right, to go backwards, to go off the path of what is the truth of who she is. So she gets an opportunity to meet aspects of herself along the way. One of them is the scarecrow, the first one. And what's his issue? His issue is that he thinks he doesn't have a brain. This is a part of herself that isn't sure whether she, in fact, has a brain. Is she smart enough? Is she clever enough? And the author is actually was actually a strong supporter of the suffragette movement. So it was probably a big thing for him to recognize that women, yes, are smart and do have brains, and so we should treat them as such. So that was kind of a subtext that he may have been working on. But so that's the question, and it's a common question for all of us. So then the next one is a really critical one for her. The next one is the Tin Man, and what's he missing? He isn't really missing it, right? None of these people, these images, are really missing anything. He believes he's missing a heart. And sure enough, she's wondering herself, is she missing a heart? If you remember the black and white portion of it, it's all about, what are they doing? And how come that person's so mean? And what about my dog? And I need my dog, and everybody's so cruel to me, and I have to do too many chores, and whine, complain, right? Where's the heart in that? Where's the love in that? Where's the compassion in that? She lost her heart. She'd forgotten that too is part. It's so tempting to think that growing up and being adult in the world means we're without heart. The bigger story, the bigger truth is to be adult in the world with heart. That's the challenge. That's the piece that needs to be paid attention to. And then the last one, of course, is that lion, right? Who didn't have, or believed he didn't have, any courage. But we see throughout the story that, of course, he does have courage. And this, too, is part of herself that's saying, I'm not sure if I have courage. And through the challenges and things, she starts to recognize that, in fact, she does. And as she continues on that, she gets a little bit more on the path. But the really interesting part that I think was the greatest for me when I was watching it as a kid is, they finally get to Oz, right? And then the curtain is taken away, and Toto whips away the curtain, and they find out it's all just a little tiny guy, probably not much bigger than me, just pushing a bunch of buttons, right? And the whole thing is an illusion. And yet it isn't, because they have all found, despite that illusion, exactly what it is that they came to find. And they found it themselves. They didn't need the external to figure it out because it was already within them. So they were following a curriculum, a syllabus, if you can say, each of those characters. And then if you take Dorothy as an archetype and allow her to embrace all of those characters, they're all parts of her, allowing her to grow and to experience and to express herself in new and different ways. And so when she actually comes back to the land of the relative, right? She's now interacting in real form with real people. She comes back with a fierce kind of courage and a recognition of her own ability to articulate and her own ability to sort of say, no, you guys, you don't understand. You don't understand what I saw. You don't understand what I saw. This is what I saw. This is the truth of what's really here. And they say, well, of course we love you. Of course we've always loved you. How did you ever think otherwise? Well, I forgot. But now that love goes so much deeper. And she was able to vanquish that witch part, perhaps, of herself. Now, we don't get to see what the interaction is like. I don't think we do. Somebody could correct me there. I'm just trying to remember. But my guess is that if the so-called witch is showing up, her experience of that witch is probably now coming from a place of compassion, coming from a place that's far, far different than it was at the beginning of the story, coming from a place of sort of being able to see what life is like for somebody else and being able to sort of engage with that and help that person on with their journey by being able to be there for them as well. So my experience of having this sort of concept of you being the curriculum is that when we go in and when we have these challenges and we go in within ourselves, we get to sort of say, okay, that was interesting. How do I now want to choose to do something differently? Because now I'm aware. We like to say I got tweaked, right? So now I'm aware I got tweaked by something. What's that about? What am I, my higher self, trying to teach me so that I can be more in alignment with that absolute part of who I am, so that I can see everything in technicolor, right? Instead of just black and white. Because the technicolor, even if we think in some level it's an illusion, it isn't an illusion. It is the truth of who we are that comes from within. It really is. And the illusion is that we think somebody else is pulling all those strings. We're pulling our own strings. That was something Wayne Dyer used to talk about, right? Who's pulling your string? We're pulling our own strings. We're the ones that are in charge here, and we're the ones gets to have the experience that we choose to have based on how we interact with our own being. and our own beingness. So a couple of other quotes from you in order to sort of bring this home a little bit. Brene Brown says, owning our story, whatever that is, remember all those things, your passions, your failings, all those kinds of things, owning our own story and loving ourselves through that process is the bravest thing that we will ever do. I know for me, anytime I've been able to sort of stand in my truth, it has felt like it was pretty darn brave, because it can be scary doing that. It can definitely be scary. And the other thing that he says here as well is, this is going back to Troward, he says, it's because we are trying to be or to do something which is not natural to us that we experience weariness and labor. So it was only when she started to sort of embrace these parts of who she is, going back to Dorothy, or in my case, started to embrace the parts of who I am, that the weariness started to leave me. So keeping up all of those parts of me was exhausting. But when I could just relax and start to be who I am and say, you know what, this kind of work, actually, it doesn't serve me because it's not who I am. It's too difficult for me to continue to be that. I need to accept who I am and move through that. Or it is exactly the right place for me. What do I need to change so that I can bring that into alignment? And that's the discernment part. That's up to us to try and figure out, is this something that we need to move away from, or is it something that we need to move towards? Where are we getting those messages and how are we interpreting them? So the other piece that I wanted to mention is he says, these three things we may attain by simply living naturally with ourselves. So he talks about the way of peace. So the way of peace is the way we are choosing to be in the world, the way that we choose to show up, the way that we are in the relative. How are we interacting? What are we doing? And how do we maintain that as a way of peace? The path is a path of joy. So if you're on a path of sorrow, you might want to try and look at what would a path of joy look like. Did you miss a turn? Right? Was there a turn back there somewhere that would have been more joyous? Is it worth re-examining? You're now a new person. You can't go back, but you can go forward and seek whatever that path of joy is. And then he says, once you've figured out those two things, once you've figured out your way of peace and your path of joy, that's when you get to be on the road to eternal life. And that eternal life is you being in, as Missy pointed out from Ernest Holmes, in that I am presence. You're now in that alignment where you're living most of your life from an absolute place and being able to look at the relative as a reflection of who you already are. It gets really fascinating and really fun if you get there. And sometimes I can only hold on to it for like maybe, an hour or maybe half an hour. It's hard to live in this world and look at everything as a metaphor, right? But practice it, because when you do, it gets so much richer, so much deeper, and so much more profound, and your choices get so much more refined. And you become closer in touch with who you really are, which is wonderful, and that's a gift for everybody. So I'm going to leave you with that. That is you are the curriculum. So think about your syllabus. Think about your desires, your strengths, your weaknesses, your family of origin. Think about all those things and see which part of your curriculum, or which part of your syllabus you want to examine a little bit more closely. And have a look and see if there's anything in there that will lead you closer to that path of joy and peace and eternal life. Thank you.